So, Professor Singh, thank you for, and I use the term advisedly, a very rich presentation. By that, I mean it opens up so many areas for thought, analysis, research, and ultimately, hopefully, action. Let me just briefly allude to a few. First of all, when you describe the constituents, the interests involved in general, country A and country B, well, I think of, say, U.S. and China. There's an important constituency in the U.S. that has never been to China or to India or outside of the country, for that matter, but they're impacted by events in China. American companies and their employees who produce products that are competitive with China or India or any other country, they're important. They're an important stakeholder, and sometime maybe some people who specialize in international relations will analyze that to a greater degree. But there's a point you made in passing that got me really thinking in terms of opening up an area for research. The bilateral benefits of multilateral meetings. When the head of a state, for example, when two meet, that is a big deal. The preparation that goes into those meetings on both sides, the entourages that are brought, the expectations, the public presentations, and the media coverage. These are pageantry often. Yet, at a multinational meeting, some of the most valuable sessions are the informal interactions between two countries at a time, often simultaneously, without all that showmanship. And yet, they couldn't do that in the absence of the multilateral meeting. So one of the important benefits that aren't rarely ever associated with multilateral organizations and their meetings is the great opportunity for, obviously, the heads of these countries, but I can also point out from some experience the key advisors to those heads of countries. They themselves can have the informal meetings, so that even though nominally very little results from the multilateral meeting, great deal of benefit is generated. But there's so many other things that come to mind. I won't try to monopolize. But so thank you for truly a very rich presentation.
Thank you. Indeed, I should have mentioned that. So good that this point also came in. It's in my notes here, right? That several bilateral initiatives in whether it is India-Pakistan relationship, which is far more difficult relationship, and also in China-India relationships, have actually occurred in multilateral forums, where, very rightly said, when you have bilateral meetings, the media creates an expectation high. And even if two leaders did achieve something, it looks very little. So there is always a sense of lack of achievement in bilateral summits because media generates so much expectation. Perfect, because in multilateral forums, focus is on multilateral issues. So many bilateral breakthroughs, and that is true of India's relationship, especially with Pakistan, because that's a very sensitive relationship. And leaders find it very difficult to break ice after each, terrorist attack or any other, event that could occur. And invariably, multilateral forums is where the breaking of ice sort of happens. So that is a direct benefit of multilateral forums and participation of India and China into multilateral forums on their bilateral relationships. I fully agree, I should have mentioned that's perfectly true of India-China relations.
How much do you think, as India and China try to develop better ties, kind of America can get in the way? I mean, I'm thinking of the South China Sea or places where you're starting to have real contestation, and suddenly American Navy gets invited to go to places we haven't been before and things like that. So there's always this 800-pound gorilla in the background, I think it must be, for when you try to talk to China. So.
That is how we often see it. In all China-India parleys, United States is already at the back of mind. And this is true that any gesture that is seen by United States, being closer to China, upsets people in India, and likewise closer relationship with India upsets people in China, just on assumption that this is going to negatively impact on bilateral relations. I remember in 2005 that, no, earlier, 2005, Clinton had visited Beijing, and there was some phrase used that China and US will work together to resolve South Asian issues. This created such a furor in India. It can't be 2005 because 2005 is when relationship began to change in India-US relationship. So it's much earlier, maybe 95 somewhere. Yes, that is true.
Mm-hmm.
But it is particularly true of India-US relationships because China-US relationship does not enhance Chinese credentials in international system as much as India-US relationship enhance India's credentials in international system. So 2005 onwards, when India-US relationships have become much closer, I normally describe it as multiple steps that affect Chinese. First, most simple thing that occurs is that if Indian diplomats and politicians are busy engaging United States, they have that much less time to engage China. So China gets neglected for a year. Chinese don't see this neglect as innocuous and innocent. They obviously see that as anti-China. So it has a multiple impact on the relationship. But United States is also everybody's neighbor, is how we describe United States. United States is the only country which is everywhere. And therefore it has stakes in all regions. We are now describing China having stakes in all across Asia. We call it that even United States endorses China as the most important player across Asia. Six-party talks is an example. So if China is a player in entire Asia, United States is a player across the whole planet, India is a player in Southern Asia. We also now have changed it from South Asia to Southern Asia. So our circles, as if they do overlap. And the positive spin that I give it from an Indian perspective is to say that we are now into, Gandhiji, the father of nation, used to talk about concentric circles. In a still water, if you throw 5 pebbles, they make 5 circles. But they crisscross each other, they don't push and shove each other, these circles. So when you are in multiple circles, that kind of international system is more comfortable for elite of India than it is for elite of China. China relatively is one language, Han society, is used to a different kind of way of life. India is so much multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious, multi everything, that we are perfectly okay with mosaics. We are perfectly okay with any mosaic having any particular shade dominating. Dominating shades could shift every time in the mosaic, depending on where the sun is reflecting. So in long run, India is perhaps more comfortable with mosaic kind of an international system, is more comfortable with concentric circles where different players are playing different roles in different regions. China is perhaps more comfortable with old system of poles. If you call it polycentric or bipolar or multipolar, that's the system where Chinese are more comfortable. I'm just making a hazarding a guess from New Delhi. I don't know how far true is that. So yes, United States is a player. United States is a player, is okay with India. I'm only guessing that it is perhaps not so much okay with Chinese. So it perhaps upsets them more, and it raises Indian stature much faster, much bigger. So India is in some ways on a gaining side there, in the same equation where United States influences both the relationships, bilaterally with Chinese and Indians, and of course also but China-US and India-US relations. So there's a positive thing, I think, for India here in the relationship and in the influence that United States holds across the world and in Asia.
Jim mentioned the gorillas and so on. What about the monkeys? You have these local centers of potential centers of conflict. You have three nuclear powers living side by side. One that is actually experiencing a very difficult period, no end in sight. You have the Tibetan issue, it's not drying away anywhere. Interestingly enough, the situation in Kashmir has kind of, seems to have died out. I can't figure out why. Are these local, how do they work together with your autonomism and?
Let me again hazard a perspective to share with you. As an academic, I see it that as China and India begin to view each other differently, with this exposure to multilateralism, with this sense of responsibility that comes with being an emerging economy, several scholars describe these conflicts in the local area as language of signaling. And there's a very crude expression we use sometimes to say we bark but don't bite each other. So these local conflicts, yes, are sometimes utilized to communicate the displeasure. So Chinese utilization of these local conflicts, of territorial claims, of sending PLA troops for rehabilitation in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, or signaling anti-India sentiments in things like Asian Development Bank or in the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Once you understand that it's an asymmetric relationship, this is also an understanding in India that these are conflicts which are not going to fundamentally derail the relationship, but will be utilized as language of signaling, that there is a displeasure in how India conducts itself and that we are not paying enough attention to Beijing. But it does squeeze India, definitely. It's not to say that Chinese don't have the capacity to put pressure on India. Yes. Samuel Hirsch article in New York Times about 2 years ago said 7,000 to 11,000 PLA soldiers in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Now that immediately, whether it is true or not, puts pressure on Indian mind, or their investments in infrastructure projects in the same region, or issuing of paper visas for Indians from that part of India. All kinds of signaling, but it does put pressure on India. Yes, there is. I often call it now, Chinese are able to squeeze India from both sides. Traditionally, they had relationship with India's small neighbors, and there's a small state syndrome, small neighbor syndrome, and India feeling very normal amongst these smaller states, which are neighbors of India. And difficult to say whether Chinese really encouraged that anti-India sentiment, but smaller neighbors had China as an alternative. So if India is not able to provide enough aid to Sri Lanka to rebuild a small town called Hambantota, which is where tsunami had destroyed that small fishing village, Chinese are able to go and turn it into second largest urban center. Whether it is anti-India intention or it is just investment purely on commercial basis, it's open for interpretations. So bilateral relationships around India's neighbor is a squeeze from below. And now multilateral. China is the most active observer in SAARC. So it talks about now starting some kind of a South Asia based China-South Asia Business Forum, China-South Asia Free Regional Trade Area, China-South Asia Cultural Organizations, which is a squeeze from above. So yes, potentially Chinese have a larger capacity to squeeze India from both above and below. But so far, it's not as bad. As I said, I go back to my original comment, I see it more like language for signaling rather than actually intending to harm India. So we only, as I said, bark but not bite is the state of relationships now, but there could always be a bite.
By the way, your earlier comment about Gandhi's concept of concentric circles reminds me of an American poet, and I'll just summarize very quickly. This man, the person he was interacting with, drew a circle that kept him out. How did he respond? He drew a larger circle that took him in.
Yes, exactly. I think we are partly trying to do that in India.
Yeah.
Draw a larger circle.
So on this happy note, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.